morning, everyone. Sorry, I was trying to make sure I got my chart up there. We're going to jump into Numbers chapter 28 here in just a minute, and we are going to go fast. Okay, we're going to go fast. I don't intend to break down all of these feasts and offerings and vows, and I don't. We can come back sometime in the future if we want to and study what the Passover was about, and study what Pentecost was about, and study what the Feast of the Trumpets were about, and the Feast of Weeks, or whatever it is, right? We can do that sometime. That's just not my intent in this particular study. I just want to give us a glimpse, a survey view of what instructions had been given. We can, again, come back later and add maybe various texts that deal with those feasts and the various instructions given in relationship to them, not just what Numbers has to say about that. But that just really isn't my intent in relationship to this particular study. And so I'm going to kind of share a chart, 3 charts actually, with you before we're done. They just kind of help us get through and take a look at all of these things in maybe an expedited way this morning, because my hope is to go ahead and wrap this study up Wednesday night. So I'm going to cover about 3 to 4 chapters today and 3 to 4 chapters Wednesday to conclude the study. Just feels like a natural break with the gospel meeting coming in, rather than taking a break in the middle of the gospel meeting then trying to come back and jump back into it. We can start something new then when we come out of the gospel meeting that way. And so that's kind of my purpose, and I think we can do it. We just won't be able to get a lot of detail, but we can get an understanding of what these instructions are here at the end of the book. And so that's going to be my approach over the next couple of studies today and Wednesday night. But before we get any further, if you would, let's bow our heads together and share in a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, thank you for the day that you've blessed us with, this wonderful opportunity that we have to come and to appreciate your testimony, to learn more from your will, to know and understand your instructions to your people, and the guidance that you gave them, and the purposes that you wanted them to remember with each of these vows and ordinances and feast days and commands and instructions that you gave them. Father, help us to appreciate your guidance is true, that your word is truth, and that all that you share with us is for our benefit and strength. Encourage us today, strengthen us in every righteous endeavor. Thank you for Jesus, and it's through his name that we pray. Amen. Okay, so there are basically 3 or 4 different types of offerings and things that they're going to have to do. And the very first one at the beginning of the chapter, in Numbers chapter 28, and I realize that print's a little bit small, and I'll do the best I can to make it as big as I can for you to see. But what's the very first one he talks about? Yeah, the daily offerings, right? So the very first one he tells them about here in Numbers chapter 28 is you're going to have a daily offering, and it's basically going to be what? 2 lambs, right? We're going to have 2 lambs. We're going to have one in the morning and one in the evening, and we're going to add some flour to this. We're going to have some oil involved in this sacrifice that's made. There's going to be some other things that are going to be introduced into this. But every morning and every evening, you're going to make this sacrifice. Now, is that individual or collective, by the way? That's collective. Okay, right. This is congregational then. For all of the people, a daily sacrifice. Everybody didn't have to get up every morning and sacrifice a lamb, and then everybody get up, go before they go to bed, sacrifice another one. This is congregational here on this daily offering. That God commands for them. And it will remind them daily then that what? God is doing what? God's providing, right? Every day. It's interesting. What did Jesus say in his prayer about every day? Yeah, give us this day our daily bread. In that model prayer that Jesus shares, he talks about the idea of daily sustenance, right? A recognition that God's care is continual and daily. And though different in the verbiage and the mechanics, if you will, of the conversation when Jesus offers his disciples that example, it's still the same principle. They're going to get up every day and finish every day with a sacrifice that will remind them of God's blessings that he provided every day. And that was the first offering that they were to remember. What's the second? And when's it going to occur? Okay, the Sabbath offerings are the next in that list, verses 9 through 10 of chapter 28. These are going to be offered then in what way? Not every day, but every week, right? Every Sabbath, which comes once a week, they're going to have this, and we're going to do the same basic thing, right? 2 lambs, a year old, without defect, grain offering, 2/10 of an ephah, a little more than the daily one, mixed in with the oil, and there'll be some drink offerings in relationship to the Sabbath offerings as well. But why was the Sabbath important? It was the day of rest, right? And it's been that way for them, right? It was a reminder that God rested when He concludes His process of creating the earth and all things in it. It's a reminder to them, even when they had, God was feeding them with manna, they weren't allowed to what? Weren't allowed to collect it on the Sabbath day, right? They've been reminded of that throughout this period where they were to collect enough on the day Friday, the day before, they were to collect enough for 2 days. The only day, by the way, they were allowed to do what? Yeah, collect more than they needed, right? Every other day, they were only allowed to collect what they needed for the day. And then on the day, Friday, before Sabbath, they were allowed to collect twice as much in order to carry them through the Sabbath. But this offering was going to be offered every Sabbath and a reminder of those things. So we got daily offerings, then we add a weekly offering on the Sabbath. Then what do we add? A monthly. One that happens at the beginning of each month, and it's a little more what, you might say, in terms of quantity. Yeah, it's bigger. It's more involved. It's a larger, more substantial offering. Just notice 2 young bulls, 1 ram, 7 male lambs, a year old without defect, grain offering of fine flour mixed with oil, and a drink offering. So a smaller offering every day, a little more on the Sabbath to remind them of those important aspects. And then at the beginning of every month, we're going to have a much more substantial offering in praise to God and a reminder of again, His benefit to them as you begin anew every month. Those were the 3 basic, right? The basic offerings that they were going to have. Daily, Sabbath, and monthly. But then He adds some special moments that they need to remember. And He gives them some pretty specific instructions as to what those are going to entail. What was the first of those? The Passover. It happens on the 14th day of the first month. And it was the same offerings as the monthly ones, plus an additional grain and drink offering in relationship to a reminder of Passover. What did it remind them of, by the way? Deliverance from Egypt, right? That final moment in that process of God, one plague after another, getting Egypt to eventually relent and let the people go. And this would be a continual reminder of the final, when God allows for them to be passed over in some senses of that plague of the death of the firstborn when they had used the blood of the goats over the doorpost. But this would be a yearly reminder of how God delivered them out of Egypt. And so every 14th day of the first month throughout their history, they were to honor the feast of Passover. What would make that significant in the New Testament? Okay, so that's when Jesus is sacrificed, right? What's going on in Jerusalem when Jesus is ultimately crucified is the celebration, or the feast of Passover is going on in the midst of that. If you recall, they were concerned about that a little bit. We're trying to rush some things around in order to kind of get the situation resolved before it kind of came to fruition. But that was what was going on, and it's interesting because Jesus then, in symbolic ways, becomes the final Passover sacrifice. in that kind of picture. No more would they need to do those sacrifices. Jesus' sacrifice would end the need for all other sacrifices. He would be the final sacrifice necessary to bring benefit unto man. The next then was the Feast of Weeks. What do we typically call that? Pentecost. Okay, generally we call that Pentecost. If we refer to it, we most often would refer to it as Pentecost because it happens when? Yeah, 50. So 7 weeks, right? 49 days plus a day gets us to the Feast of Weeks. 7 weeks plus a day. Pentecost, 50. That's where we get to. What was significant about Pentecost in the New Testament? Yeah, in Acts chapter 2, that's the feast that's going on when the disciples had gathered together and were waiting for the promised Comforter, the one that would guide them to all truth, Jesus told them. They've been waiting there for that moment to occur from the time of Jesus' death. I mean, you got his resurrection, then he was seen several days, right? So it's not, but they've been waiting there now until this power would come. That's the significance in relationship to New Testament times. But on this occasion, they were going to offer 2 young bulls, 1 ram, 7 male lambs a year old without defect, grain and drink offerings, and 1 male goat for a sin offering. So lots of sacrifice still going on. We just experienced it 7 weeks plus a day earlier at Passover. Now we've come to Pentecost, and we're going to have more sacrifices being made. And it would also tie into some of the early harvest kinds of things as it relates to their feasts as well. The next is the Feast of Trumpets. It happens on the first day of the 7th month. Anybody know why that's significant? Okay, so sometimes that completeness is used in relationship to 7. Chronologically, they actually looked at the 7th month, the beginning of it, as their new year. So we look at the first day of the first month of a year as the new year, right? But they did not. They viewed the first day of the 7th month as their new year, the new beginning, okay? What do you do to celebrate in that time period? You blow on a trumpet, right? We blow a trumpet to signify the ushering in of a new year. And so it's going to happen. In fact, there's a lot of stuff that happens in this Jewish New Year, if you will, in this 7th month. So on the first day, you do the Feast of Trumpets, this celebratory entering into new beginnings at the beginning of the new year. Same offerings as the monthly, plus a special burnt offerings that would be there. On the 10th day of that month, then we're going to do what? We're going to have a Day of Atonement. Okay? We're going to have a Day of Atonement on that 10th day of the 7th month. Same offerings as the monthly, plus we're going to have a special sin offering during that moment for the atonement of the people, right? And to recall their need for atonement as it relates to God's mercy to them. And then what's the final one? Okay, Feast of Tabernacles, and it's going to begin on the 15th day of the 7th. So trumpets on sorry about that. Didn't turn my phone, and somebody just hit the Wi-Fi, and my phone told me. But anyway, this Feast of Tabernacles, he says 15th day of the 7th month, and notice this, 13 bulls on the first day of the celebration, reducing by 1 then each day for 7 days, 2 rams, 14 male lambs, each day with accompanying grain and drink offerings, and 1 male goat for a sin offering every day for this 7-day feast. It's a lengthy process. Go ahead. Yeah. Yeah, there is a lot of sacrificing going on in this particular. And Feast of Tabernacles is going to remind them of what? Yeah, that they lived in tents. And by the way, there are still some Orthodox Jews who still do this. And will reside for 7 days inside some kind of temporary structure. Sometimes if you Google it, you'll find some interesting and creative ways that they do that. But there are still folks today that still honor levels of these feasts, not necessarily so much of the sacrifice side of it. There's not a lot of that going on, but there is some symbolic gestures towards these events even today. And one of those is that there are some that still will reside in temporary tent-like structures for a celebratory reminder of the Feast of Tabernacles that was described there at the end of chapter 29. Those are the basic offerings. Daily, weekly on the Sabbath, once a month, then some special offerings that are going to happen between Passover, Pentecost, or Feast of Weeks, the ushering in of new beginnings at the beginning of the seventh month, their new year. Then you're going to have a Day of Atonement in that month as well, and you're going to conclude that month with this Feast of Tabernacles, or tents, dwelling places, that they would ultimately have to honor and appreciate. Your thoughts or questions about any of those? And again, I know we could have dug way deeper. I just chose not to in this particular study. All right, so let's jump to the next thing then. He begins now in chapter 30. That was chapter 28 and 29, by the way. In chapter 30, he begins to talk about vows and the responsibility of making vows or promises. Contractual things were going to be important to them, right? When you're living in these communal kind of situations, and people are making agreements. I need some lambs for my flock, and I've got some goats, and you need goats, and we're trying to make arrangements and things. We've got to have some ways to govern how vows and promises and even contracts, in a sense, were being made among the people. And there were varying types that he notes here, and we can compare to modern times all day long, and it won't change, that this was the culture, the scene, and the purposes that God rendered in the moment as it relates to this. So basically, when a man made a vow, it's what? It's done. If a man makes a vow, it's binding and it must be fulfilled. He can't break his word. He must do everything he said. That's the start of the process. If he makes the vow, he's keeping the vow. Period.
Did Solomon say something about that in Proverbs? If you make a vow, you have to keep it.
Yeah, I'm trying. There are some varying texts.
I prefer not to keep it. I think.
Yeah.
I can't remember right.
Yeah, I'm not.
Where it is, but.
Yeah. So, if a woman makes a vow and she's married, what can happen? The husband can overrule it. Okay? So if she makes a vow and she's married, the husband can step in and say, no. I know that sounds odd, maybe in our mindset, but remember, most likely if she's making a vow, she's committing him to honor it, okay? Because whatever it is that most likely she doesn't have access to this to herself. Because remember those daughters that came? They were really concerned, right? In the prior chapter we looked at Wednesday, because they were afraid when they got into the promised land, their dad didn't have any sons, and because they knew that in the culture and in the design of things, that everything trickled down from the fathers and the men within the families. And to sustain everybody else, the women, the children, everybody else in those families, was the responsibility from the top down. And so think about that a little bit when you relate to this. So if she makes a commitment, she may not necessarily be committing things of value that are under her control. She's actually committing, so he can step in and say, no, that we're not doing that. If a woman makes a vow, her husband can either confirm it or nullify it as it relates to that. And there'll be one more extra thought we'll share later, and it comes up later in the text that we can share with you. I'm not sure why my chart jumped it around a little bit, but let me jump you down. So men's vows, verses 1 and 2. Let me jump down on the chart. Verses 3 and 5 through 5 talk about the unmarried. The unmarried's vow can be overruled by whom? Father. So if a young woman makes a vow, again, if she's committed something, where's it coming from? It's coming from the father. And so he has the right to nullify, overrule that. And if a young woman in her father's house makes a vow, the father can confirm or nullify it. Go back to if they're widowed or divorced, the text says in verse 9, they're binding at that point. Because she's making that vow without connectivity to a father or a husband that's responsible for it. So if a widow or divorced woman makes a vow, it's binding, the law said in verse 9.
Brian, what I said about Solomon, that's in Ecclesiastes 5 and verse 4. When you make a vow to God, do not delay to pay it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you have vowed.
Yeah.
Better to vow than to vow and not pay.
So even sometime later, the Ecclesiastes writer is reminding them of the importance of honoring when a vow is made. Here was the part, and again, I apologize for getting them out of sequence. But then in verse 14, he talks about vows confirmed by silence. Silence equals confirmation. So if a husband or a father doesn't speak up when he hears of the vow, it stands. So go back to those earlier rules. He's either got to confirm or nullify it. If his wife makes a vow, he either has to say yes or no. If his daughter makes a vow, he has to say yes or no. And his silence equals yes. His silence equals yes. Interesting, by the way, just a tidbit of knowledge for you. That rule still applies in certain governing bodies to this day. Under Robert's Rules of Order in meeting proceedings, if a member of some board or committee is supposed to vote and they just sit there silent and refuse to say yay or nay, it is a yay. It gets marked down legally and binding as a yay. Silence is yes. I agree with this. That's an interesting principle when you think about it, right? We like to think silence is non-binding of anything, right? We like to think of silence as just, I'm not saying anything about this. But in certain circumstances, and this circumstance are described here, silence is yes. And the truth be known, in a lot of different circles, sometimes our silence is actually agreement. Just because we didn't confirm it or validate it with our voice, so that maybe we could try to argue ignorance later or whatever it might be. It's not really the case. The father or that husband, if he's going to say something, he better say it when he knows. Because if he's silent, then he's in agreement. That's a yes, which means that vow's binding. So whatever his wife bound that family to, he's committed to it. Whatever that daughter committed that family to, they're committed to it. Because he did not speak up one way or the other as it relates to it. I didn't see any in the text. I have to go back and look at some of the others. But I'm sure there's a reasonable expectation there. But
a father might want to think about something.
Yeah. But I don't know of any specified. I'd have to go back and look. All right. Any thoughts or questions about that there in chapter 30? All right. So jump to chapter 31. Just shrink it down a little bit. So chapter 31 is interesting, right? Because he's dealing now with when you go to war, and initially it's going to be with whom? Who's the nation under description here? The Midianites, right? So this is going to be the template of what do you do when you've gone to war as a nation, right? You've gone to war, and when you're victorious, you get the what? Spoils of war, right? Spoils of war come to you. What are you going to do with them? And so God doesn't leave that to them to decide on their own. He tells them this is how you're going to handle the spoils of war. So the first thing is they take up the totality of the spoils. And yes, friends, you can't sugarcoat realities of war in that time period. But the spoils of war would have included what interesting aspect? People. People. And it's hard for us to get our mind around that. I get it. But in that time period, and we can, again, can't unpack all that in 5 minutes here. But remember, if I come in and I take over this nation of people, and I've destroyed their leadership, I've destroyed their ability to guide themselves. They don't have any. They're now depending on whom? For survival. They're depending on me now for survival. And so I'm going to have to care. I'm going to have to care for all these folks and find ways. And yes, would some of them end up becoming servants in various aspects? Yes. But their very survival depends on me doing something with them as it relates to this. And so here's how it's going to happen. So those who went and fought are going to get what? Okay, so they're going to get half of the total spoils. So all those warriors that went to battle, everybody that goes out to battle, half of that is going to be distributed among them. Then the rest, the other half of the spoils, is going to be distributed where? Okay, among the community in general, but then there's going to be some specific things as it relates. So then to the community in general, but the warriors, for one out of every what? Out of every 500. So one out of every 500 lambs or goats or whatever it is that were the spoils of war, one out of every 500 is going directly to Eleazar. And remember, every priest is a Levite, but not every Levite is a priest. Okay? Always remember that. Every priest is a Levite, but not every Levite is a priest. Priesthood, very direct line, right? Aaron, Eleazar, and that will continue. So Eleazar and those under him, a smaller number of people, because they're very specific to those purposes that God has established for them, he's going to receive that one out of every 500 from the warrior's half. Okay, from the warrior's half. That's how he's going to gain benefit from the spoils of war, because obviously he didn't and they didn't go to war. That's not what they do. It's not what the priests and the Levites do. The Levites, they as a whole, they're going to get their sustenance from the spoils of war from the community's half, right? From the community's half of the spoils, but a much higher percentage, one out of every 50 of whatever it is that was the spoils of war, that's going to go to the Levites as a whole to sustain them. Well, more needful, right? Because there's more of them. And keep in mind, those warriors that went to battle, they're also part of whom? Now, that's a weird way to ask that maybe, but they're not independent tribes that are called the warrior tribes. No, they're part of... So when they bring their spoils of war home, it's also benefiting the community, right? The community at large, because they're part of those communities. So there's this interesting balance in how it is that God is determined. But what I love about it is this. God takes out the arguments and the fussing. And right, well, you'd think he would have. It won't stop them at times from still fussing at each other over things. But he's eliminated that. They don't have to wonder, what are we going to do with all this stuff now? They know what they're supposed to do with it. They've been given guidance and instructions. And the spoils of war are going to start, but they're not going to end for a while, right? Because when they go to conquest the land, they're going to get houses they didn't build. They're going to get wells they didn't dig. They're going to get they're going to receive a tremendous amount of benefit. And Moses warns them about complacency and not forgetting God in the equation in Deuteronomy chapter 9. So he's giving them instructions and guidance to help them process, if you will, through all of the various things that they may encounter. Offerings, vows, how do we distribute the spoils of war? That's what chapters 28 through 31 discussed with the people, and you just got the synopsis of those things. Any of your questions? We got about 2.5 minutes. Thoughts? I can move forward, by the way. All right, so you get a general idea, right, of what's going on there. Jump to chapter 32. We can go ahead and look at this for a moment. Again, our time's about up. But let's talk a little bit about what happens in chapter 32. So, who comes to Moses here with a problem? So the children of Reuben and Gad. And what's their basic issue? Okay, they got a lot of things, and they basically want to what? Okay, yeah, they want to stay over here, right? Let me see if I can pull you a map up real quick. And I should have put one up of the tribes. I'll do that next time. But remember, what are you doing? I have no idea why I did that. I'm just trying to do it this way. Okay. So they've been living, if you recall, they tried to cross Edom. They didn't like that idea. They circumvented Seir, the Mount Seir, for a while. God says enough of that. Finally lets them turn the corner and head back to the north. They work their way up towards Jericho, up at the top of the screen there. But over here on this side of the sea and over this side of Jordan, Reuben and Gad kind of made themselves a pretty good place. And they've had how long, by the way, to do that? Yeah, several years, right? They've had several years to kind of establish themselves. And their basic request is what? Can we stay over here? And what's the basic response Moses gives them? Yeah, yes, but. Yeah, and you're right. The inquiry of God, is this permissible? And the response is, you can, but you're going to be first ones to cross over to start fighting. You go fight for your brothers, and then you can come home and live over here. But you're going to go fight for your brothers first. You're not going to be excused from those responsibilities just because you want to stay over here. Because truth be known, there might be a whole lot of other folks that just say, why go fight if I can just stay here and sustain myself? So that's what's happening in chapter 32, is this discussion, if you will, and understanding of how they're going to handle the desire for Reuben and Gad, and who else ends up over there too, by the way? And half of Manasseh ends up over there too, as it relates to this decision making. But all of them are going to have responsibilities to go and to fight and to honor those obligations. I'll talk maybe a smidge more, whatever amount a smidge is, but I'll talk a little bit more on Wednesday, maybe a little bit about this, and then we can finish up. We'll finish up our discussion in those last few chapters of the book of Numbers.